There's a bird outside your window right now that you've never once thought about eating. It walks on your sidewalk, it sits on your ledge, it eats your leftover fries without asking. Pigeons live on every continent except Antarctica. Scientists estimate there are hundreds of millions of them worldwide. Almost nobody alive today has tasted one. That's strange, because for most of human history, this exact bird was dinner, not a rare dinner, a normal one. Something changed. And it wasn't the pigeon. If even one of your distant ancestors had failed to figure out how to catch, raise, and eat this bird during a hard winter, your family line might have ended right there. That's not an exaggeration. Pigeons were one of the easiest, most reliable sources of meat early humans ever found. The real answer to why we stopped eating them is stranger than they got dirty, or we got squeamish. There's a specific historical turning point involved, and we're not getting to it yet. Sit with that for a second. Here's why this question actually matters. We tend to think of food history as this smooth, logical march toward better hygiene and better taste. But that's not really what happened here. An animal that fed empires for thousands of years got quietly erased from the modern plate, while the bird itself thrived more than ever. Understanding why tells you something uncomfortable about how fast a culture can forget its own survival tools. It also tells you something about your own instincts. That flicker of you might feel imagining a pigeon dinner right now. Researchers believe that reaction isn't ancient. It's recent. It was taught to you. Let's start with the myth we need to demolish first. Most people assume pigeons became inedible because city pigeons are dirty, disease-ridden, and gross. That's the excuse people reach for automatically. But here's the problem. The pigeons your ancestors ate were not street pigeons. They were domesticated pigeons, raised specifically for food in clean, controlled conditions. The same basic idea as raising chickens. The wild, garbage-eating pigeon you see on the sidewalk today is a completely different situation. So their dirty excuse doesn't explain the whole story. It only explains why we don't eat the specific pigeons hanging around a bus stop. It doesn't explain why an entire farming tradition disappeared. To understand what really happened, you need to know about something called the columbarium, sometimes called a dovecote. This was a purpose-built structure, often a tower, made specifically to house thousands of pigeons at once. Ancient Egyptians used them. So did the Romans. So did medieval Europeans right up through the 1700s. These towers weren't decoration. They were food infrastructure, as essential as a barn or a well. Pigeons bred fast needed almost no expensive feed, and produced meat, eggs, and something else that turned out to be even more valuable than the meat itself. But there was one detail about these towers that eventually turned neighbor against neighbor, and it's the most surprising part of this entire story. We'll get to it. Let's look at the actual scale of this. In medieval France alone, historians estimate there were around 42,000 Dovecotes standing across the countryside. 42,000. Read that number again. 42,000 towers, each one holding anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand birds. In ancient Egypt, entire villages built their economy partly around pigeon towers, using the birds for food and using their droppings as premium fertilizer, sometimes valuable enough to be taxed separately from the birds themselves. In Persia, some dovecotes were built tall enough to hold an estimated 50,000 pigeons in a single structure. This wasn't a hobby. It was industrial-scale food production, centuries before anyone used that phrase. Here's the twist. Something that sounds primitive when you first hear it, a tower full of pigeons, was actually a remarkably efficient system. Pigeons convert food into meat faster than almost any other domesticated bird. They don't need much space. They reproduce constantly, and their droppings were so nutrient-rich that in some regions, pigeon manure was worth more money than the meat. Farmers weren't keeping pigeons because they had nothing better to do. They were running one of the smartest small-footprint protein systems available before modern agriculture existed. Now here's the payoff to that earlier loop. The reason dovecotes eventually caused conflict wasn't the pigeons themselves. It was who got to own them. For a long stretch of European history, only wealthy landowners and nobles were legally allowed to build and keep dovecotes. Meanwhile, the pigeons from those towers would fly out and eat crops belonging to ordinary farmers, who had no legal right to stop them or hunt them. So peasants were left protecting their fields from a rich neighbor's food source, one they weren't even allowed to eat. That imbalance built up real resentment over generations. Now think about what that means. This wasn't really a story about a bird at all. It was a story about power dressed up as farming. That resentment came to a head somewhere. History books don't spend enough time on. During the French Revolution in 1789, one of the specific privileges that got stripped from the aristocracy was the exclusive right to keep Dovecotes. Angry crowds destroyed towers that symbolized inequality, not because they suddenly hated pigeons, but because the towers represented everything unfair about who got to eat well and who didn't. Around the same period, industrial farming was starting to make chickens dramatically cheaper and easier to raise at scale. Chickens didn't carry that same political baggage. Slowly, quietly, pigeon farming faded out of the mainstream food system across much of the Western world, even though nothing about the bird itself had changed. Here's the modern mirror. In several parts of the world today, including parts of France, Egypt, and the Middle East, pigeon, often labeled squab, is still considered a genuine delicacy, served in high-end restaurants for a premium price. The same bird you'd never think twice about on a sidewalk. Meanwhile, city pigeons descended from those same domesticated ancestors, birds that escaped or were released from towers that no longer exist, are treated as pests to be shooed away. Nobody sensible is arguing you should go catch a park pigeon for dinner. That's a different bird living a different life. But it's worth noticing that an entire food tradition, one that fed empires for thousands of years, didn't vanish because it stopped working. It vanished because of politics, timing, and which animal happened to become cheaper first. So here's what actually happened, laid out simply. Pigeons were never inefficient. They were never dangerous as a food source. They fed civilizations for thousands of years through carefully engineered towers most people today have never heard of. That system collapsed not because of the bird, but because of who controlled it, and because a cheaper, less politically loaded alternative showed up at the right moment in history. You didn't inherit a dislike of pigeon meat because it's actually unpleasant. You inherited a food gap left behind by a revolution and an economic shift, one your ancestors never chose and mostly never noticed happening. They didn't have supermarkets. What they had was a tower full of birds and the knowledge to use it. You just never got handed that knowledge. It didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because history moved on without finishing the story.